What I want to do in my 15 minutes with you this evening is to introduce this, which is a model which myself and a colleague came up with just after the book was published, just slightly too late to get into the book. But it somehow kind of encapsulates the core ideas that are in the book around this question of climate change and the various crises that are coming at us head first, by the biodiversity crisis, the equality crisis, the race, all of these different things that are happening. How do we, at the heart of a lot of them, I think, is this sort of failure of our collective imagination. We're living in a time of imaginative poverty, faced by things that demand us to reimagine and rebuild everything. And our imagination muscle, which should be like that, is kind of like this. And that's really a very serious thing that we need to look at. So, and I'm not going to show you this as a graph, by the way. It's this time of the evening, nobody needs to see graphs at all, but I show you this more as a story. But I think at the moment we're standing on top of this mountain. We're standing on more fossil fuels, more CO2, more debt, more inequality, more anxiety, more trauma than we've ever stood on top of before. And the experienced guides at our side are telling us we need to get down off this mountain really quickly. For some of us, that's enough to get us down off the mountain. For a lot of people, I think that we also need to be really good at telling the story about the hospitality and what awaits us on the lower slopes. If we just talk about 80% cuts by 2030 or whatever it is, that means nothing to most people. How do we bring that alive in terms of stories and create longing? Most of my work with the transition movement fundamentally has been about the cultivation of longing. How do we create in the people, the communities around us, a longing for a low carbon future is the question I would like to explore this evening. I think one of the ways is by really feeling into the imagination and nurturing that imaginative capacity. The poet Rilke once said, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. So beautiful, I'm going to say it again. The future must enter into you a long time before it happens. This is the work of James Mackay in Leeds, the University of Leeds, who I always think of as the man who draws the future. This is his drawing of Leeds if it was the most biodiverse city in the world. If over the next 10 years we set out to maximize the biodiversity of our cities, what would it be like? What would it smell like? What would it feel like? What would a day in the life be like walking through a city that was that biodiverse? What would it be like to be in a city now? We're starting to see, as we come out of COVID, a number of cities saying we're going to take this space back from cars. Milan are putting in 22 miles of new bike lanes and pedestrianizing streets. That frees up an awful lot of space. In the UK, that 50,000 acres of land or something is down to car parks. How, if we start to take that land back, what do we do? Well, we can fill those streets with food being grown, children walking to school through food being grown. We can bring it alive in people's imaginations and create what I think of as memories of the future. It makes it so much more likely that we'll get there. When Neil Armstrong went to the moon, it wasn't his idea. We'd been going to the moon for decades. Frank Sinatra went to the moon, Tintin went to the moon, everybody went to the moon and created that longing to get there. And we've seen during the lockdown how when streets are closed, they fill up not with tumbleweed blowing past, but with people and music and play and all the things that actually are really good for us. What I want to share with you is this, which is a model that myself and a guy called Rob Shorter created, and it tries to answer the question, if we set out now intentionally to rebuild our collective imagination, what would we do? Where would we start? We think there are 4 key things, and I want to go through each of those and tell you a bit more. The first one is space. We all recognize in our own lives the times we are at our most imaginative is when there is space in our lives. Albert Einstein always said his best ideas came to him when he was riding his bicycle through a forest. And I think it's been great to see over the last few years movements like Transition and Extinction Rebellion. And I imagine the Green Party, who are increasingly designing into their organizational culture space for reflection, for celebration, for appreciation, for grief, for what if. And all of that is so much more important than just having groups that meet with an agenda to get through. How we design space into our organizations is really, really precious. And in our communities as well. This is a big event we did just before the lockdown in Totnes called Totnes Climate Emergency, What Next? That brought together many local groups to say, okay, where do we go from here? And to facilitate it in a way that it was a held space where people could ask what if, because there are so few spaces in our lives today when people can do that. And I think we need to be looking actually at things like a universal basic income, 3 or 4 day working week as being national imagination strategies as much as anything else, because they free up the space for. The second one is place, that there's a really important role for gathering places that can provide platforms for collective imagining. This is a transition group in London who one Saturday went out into their street with beautiful apple trees in blossom in pots, put them along the high street and transformed just for that day that high street into an orchard, and could have conversations with people. It meant that people, a place they knew really well, went away afterwards thinking about that space in a different way. How do we create spaces where afterwards your sense of what might be possible in the world is changed? This guy in the middle here is called Jason Roberts. He lives in Houston, Texas, works for something called Better Block. They go to places like this that nobody loves. They speak to the people around. They say, what do you think this place needs? And then they go back to their Fab Lab place and they create something. And then they arrive at dusk and no one knows they're coming. And they work overnight like they do when they're setting up the Chelsea Flower Show or something. And the next day that space has been transformed into this. They're able to then have conversations with people. This place be like? Their philosophy is, if we create enough places that nobody cares about, after a while everyone just stops caring. But I love this idea that we can just sort of pop up, give people a taste of what that future could be like in places where they don't expect it. Towns and cities can be places where you go to. Totnes sometimes plays that role for people. This is a place in France called Ungersheim, which is such a beautiful showcase of transition and how food links with economics, links with energy, links with housing, that once you've been there and had a walk around there, you go away and you never quite see the world in the same way again. And we really need places that can do that for people as well. And they towns or cities or streets or single buildings or anything. The third one is practices. What are the practices that connect, I can't see, they connect us and change our frame of possibility? So this is a part of our brain called the hippocampus. This is the part of the brain where our imagination and our memory both fire from. They're very similar in lots of ways. The interesting thing about the hippocampus is that when people are stressed or anxious or in trauma, the hippocampus can shrink by up to 20%. And when that happens, we lose the ability to see the future in hopeful and positive ways. And there's a really important part, I think, in any conversation about imagination, which is that imagination to a degree is a function of privilege. That when your basic needs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs aren't met, it's very hard to live an imaginative life. You don't know where you're going to be sleeping for the next week, or how you're going to feed your kids. It's very hard. And also we have to recognize the role of colonization and sort of structural racism in that. I just read a brilliant book by a woman called Adrienne Marie Brown, who said imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. Losing our imagination is a symptom of trauma. We're living in the ancestral imagination of others with their longing for safety and abundance, a longing that didn't include us. So I was really interested to see if I could find a place where they were setting out to intentionally rebuild the hippocampus, a kind of a campus for the hippocampus, if you like. And I went to Dundee to visit this amazing project called Art Angel on the first floor office block in the middle of Dundee. We work with people suffering from stress and trauma and anxiety. They say when you come here, you're not a patient or a client, you're an artist preparing work for an exhibition, and they help them to prepare. And I spoke to so many people, and you could see that process of the imagination being built. And I said to Rosalie, who runs it in the picture here, I said, so what's the secret to this place? She said, it's about safety and hope. We're about safety and hope. And fundamental to the work that we do around climate change has to be creating that kind of thing as well, I think. And every year, in order to keep their funding going, they do an evaluation of how well it's going. They give people a piece of paper with 2 outlines of a human body. They say, draw. First one to show how you felt before you came here. Second to show how you feel now you've been coming here for a while. I looked through a pile of them. It was very moving. There's just one I want to show you, which is kind of pretty self-explanatory, really. It feels to me like actually if we are able to do everything that needs to be done over the next 10 years with a spirit of imagination, and this is what it'll feel like. You know, this is, for me, if we get it right, is what the shift to a low. In terms of practices, one of my favorite practices that came through the transition movement is this, which is called Transition Town Anywhere, which was developed with Transition Network and a company called Encounters Arts. You get between 100 and all, you start with an exercise. You imagine stepping forward into the future. Once you get there, you then imagine, well, what am I doing there? What's my role there? You meet other people who share that. And then together with those people, you literally build it out of cardboard. You build a kind of a pop-up town out of cardboard, and people building their different things. And then you trade and you swap and you live as though this was a three-dimensional reality for about 3 hours. And to be with 300 adults totally lost in a play world of their imagining is utterly magical. We did it last October in London. These two young men here built the public transport system for Transition Town Anywhere, which might look to you like some chairs and some cardboard boxes. They could tell you everything about this, what the tickets, what color the tickets were, how the whole thing worked, what it ran on, what the seats were made out of. And it's a really, bringing play into activism in that way is so, so powerful, I think. This is one of my favorite what if stories, because I think one of the things that is really powerful that we need to be really master is the art of asking good what if questions. This is from Liège in Belgium. Transition Liège, about 5 years ago, came up with a question. They said, what if in a generation's time, the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? So beautiful, wonderful question. I went to a big event 5 years ago. They invited everyone who cared about food to launch this question. I went back last year. In that time, they'd started 25 new cooperatives. They raised 5 million euros of investment from local people to fund these. They had a farm, 2 vineyards, a brewery. They started a shop for producers. After 6 months, it did so well, they opened a second. They now have 4. The first one has doubled in size. I met the mayor of the city who said, we used to say we wanted to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. Our role here is just to get out of the way and to let this happen. And you can see a city reimagining its food system, but it started with that what if question that was really invitational. They kind of wrote the first half of a really provocative question on the blackboard and then let people fill it in themselves. And there's a real, real power in that, I think. So the last one I have for you is pacts, which might seem like a really odd word to use in relation to imagination. Why are we talking about pacts? I think this was something that came to me from looking at this project in Italy, in Bologna. So in Bologna, the municipality got to a stage of realizing that engagement in democracy was really declining. People were getting fed up. It wasn't really working. They started a thing called a civic imagination office, which sits between the municipality and communities and works like a transition group in the community. It does big visioning activities, open space, World Cafe, future dreaming kind of exercises. The really smart bit is, though, that when those activities come up with a good idea, they say, that's a good idea, that. How are we going to make that happen? We can offer this, this, and this. You can offer that and that? Good. Okay, let's make a pact. And in the last 5 years in Bologna, they've made 500 pacts that range from a little garden in the street through to turning an old office block into a school to teach young people to become classical musicians. And the thing I love about it is there is something fundamentally so respectful about inviting people's imagination, evoking the imagination, and then meeting it in the middle. Because so many of us get used to going to a consultation that asks for our ideas, and we give them, and then we go home, they throw them in the bin and just build exactly the same housing development they were going to build anyway. It's so important, if you invite people's imagination, that you respect it and you meet it in the middle, and the creation of pacts is a really exciting manifestation. So just to wrap up, for me, that's kind of what we try and do in the transition movement, is to say, okay, that's the vision of how the future could be. How do we start now in the places where we are, in the apartments, in the street, in the neighborhoods, to give people a tangible way of interacting with that future, whether it's a tiny project or a big project, whether it's a community energy project raising millions of pounds, or just people planting trees around the neighborhood. All of those things are just as important as each other, because they give people a taste and a sight and a smell and an experience that the future could be something other than what business as usual seems to have on offer at the moment. So this is the model that I bring to the meeting. This is something that I hope might inform the conversation that you might have in the second half after I'm gone. There, on the blog that I do, which is called robhopkins.net, you'll find about 4 posts ago a very detailed article about the Imagination Sundial, and a place where you can download a really high resolution. If you want to find out anything about the transition movement, transitionnetwork.org is where you can find all of that. And I recently started a podcast. Oh, and there's the book From What Is to What If, which is available in all good bookshops. I recently started a podcast series called From What If to What Next, where listeners send in their what if questions, and I find the 2 best people to explore how to make the move from it being an idea to it being a reality. And if you want to subscribe to that, which is part of the journey towards creating the sequel to the book, it'd be very lovely if you wanted to join me on that. There's some really fascinating episodes on there already, and a new one every 2 weeks. That's me. Was that 15 minutes? It's almost.
The timing was perfect. Thank you very much, Rob. That resonated a lot with me. Your message. I found that it's a very hopeful and very hopeful message. I think, and I think it's the right kind of outlook to have when we think about the crisis that we are facing. I just had a little question before we open it up more generally. You mentioned that there's this. We can approach this if we're quite privileged and don't have in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we feel safe and secure to be able to let our imagination go wild, as it were. But my question would be, how does the transmission movement try to reach out to those who don't have that luxury? Like, what ideas do you have in that?
Well, I think there are different ways. One of them is always having that question in mind: who isn't here, who should be here, and how do we get them here? How do we go to where they are? How do we build? I always find there's the thing when I go to meet groups, I always try and challenge them to, when they say, hey, we've got this really great partnership with our local permaculture group. It's like, well, that must have taken a lot of bridge building, and that must have been quite a stretch. Actually, I'm always much more interested with those kind of partnerships that are made with really unexpected organizations. And I think one of the things that we have to really realize, that what we're trying to do in the transition movement is to reimagine and rebuild local economies so that they are more resilient, more diverse, more localized. And if we imagine that we're going to do that with everybody working as volunteers on their Wednesdays after they've put the kids to bed, we're kind of kidding ourselves. And that we need to be, one of the ways that we make this something that is really relevant across the board is by creating work for people. This has to be a movement that is creating work for people. If we get transition, either in the sense of the transition movement or more widely, the transition to a very low carbon economy right, it should be creating all sorts of openings for work and employment. And if we imagine that our movements are always going to be driven by volunteers, then I think you almost inevitably end up with mostly white middle class movements of people who have spare time and people whose life experience is that if you try to change things, those things will change, which is certainly not everybody's experience at all. So I think it's a very complex question. But I think one of the things is that we need to be starting to be really realistic about creating livelihoods for people.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to pass over to Nicola, who has got some questions from the floor.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm going to go to Marie Amelie. If you want to come off mute, I think you want to ask a question.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much. I can't seem to undo my video. I'm sorry to get it going, so I'll remain without image. Thank you very much, Rob, for a really inspiring talk. I'm delighted to hear you live, so to speak. You've been an inspiration for a number of years. And in that time, I've created the Para Food Festival in Edinburgh, which celebrates community food growing precisely for the reasons you've identified here. I guess one of the things I continue to struggle with is how to reconcile the micro scale with the macro scale. And you've just started to touch on it there as we were talking about inequalities and deprivation and all these other issues which I work on in my day job. So I wonder what your thoughts are. I suspect you also struggle with the macro system as it stands and continues to be with all the what's the word I'm looking for? The status quo and all those who are very keen to protect the status quo, and all the micro activities that are flourishing but are still not enough to really change the overall system, which means that many people remain stuck, and indeed as a world we remain very stuck on the same track. That's pretty much it just now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a question that we all struggle with, and you know, the book that I mentioned, Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Emergent Strategies, that I read that quote out. She has some lovely stuff in there where she talks about fractals. You know, the belief in fractals, in that actually the work that we do at the local scale, you know, then needs to scale out to the regional scale, and that's kind of, you know, we need to be sort of working upwards in that way. I feel like living in this country, because we have such an appalling democracy that just prevents so much from happening, we kind of almost convince ourselves that it's not possible. But I've been really inspired the last few weeks seeing what's happening in France, where actually interest in a lot of this stuff is really, really taking off, and the opinion polls around people who some of you might have seen a film called Tomorrow, a French film, Demain, that came out a few years ago. That film had the most phenomenal impact that is kind of almost unimaginable in this country. Like it ran to full houses in mainstream cinemas for about 5 months. It was extraordinary. Like it was shown in local governments and the boards of big organizations. It was phenomenal. And there was opinion polls a little while ago before the lockdown that showed that the majority of people favored a sort of more localized transition kind of an approach. And they just had the elections, the mayoral elections, the local government elections, and the Green Party just surged across France and took most of the major cities. And I think there's something really fascinating going on. They just had a big citizens' assembly. They're going to have a referendum based on a citizens' assembly. You know, and actually, when I went to, you kind of get a taste of how things can spread there, in terms of, I met the deputy mayor of Paris. The mayor of Paris is doing extraordinary things in terms of getting cars out of the city and taking land back. She has this beautiful concept of a 15-minute city where everything you need is within 15-minute walk from where you live, so you don't need a car. And the film is called Tomorrow, or Demain in French. Colin and Sandra, question there. And she said, when I started working here 8 years ago at the mayor's office, I had a copy of the transition handbook, and everyone thought I was completely mad. And now they all have a copy. You know, so there's something really interesting about how these ideas kind of spread and multiply, and do kind of scale up. In Belgium now, where they have one of the most active transition movements, which is growing and growing in Belgium, again partly because of that film. They now have people who've come through the transition movement and who are kind of regional environment ministers. In Brussels, they have a minister of ecological transition, a minister of economic transition, and they're all over this stuff. So unfortunately, we're kind of living in the sort of Victorian age here, it seems like, at the moment. But I do retain a kind of a fundamental belief that actually the things that we model at the ground level, if they tell a powerful enough story, then they kind of knock on up the levels.
All right, thanks, Rob.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Pleasure.
I think we'll have time for one, maybe two more questions. So I've got one from Hannah, who says, I found the idea that we are living out the imaginations of people in the past fascinating. Can you think of any examples in our world today where this applies that are negative and we should try to rethink? Perhaps a difficult question.
I'm just going to have a look at it, actually. Where is it?
I see it in the chat.
Well, I think the fact that we live in that. I was talking with my kids the other day about, so this podcast that I do, I'm planning an episode which is going to be, what if we decolonized our education system, which is a really interesting kind of live question at the moment. And I was talking to my kids, we were talking about history, about learning history in school, you know, in that actually I learned about Henry VIII and what happened to his various wives and the establishment of the Church of England, and a little bit about the First World War. I think that was it. My son learned about King Henry VIII and some battle or something. I mean, just totally pointless rubbish, really. And none of us learned anything about slavery or the British Empire. And you see it in America now, where there's a guy I interview in the book who uses this term, the Trump disimagination machine, where he talks about this kind of intentional structural dismantling of people's imagination. And one of the ways that you do that is by kind of taking people's history back from them. And so I think when we live in a country where you have government ministers who like in the US, who will say things like, well, the slaves came to America because they were in search of opportunity. You know, they came here almost that they kind of came here on holiday and decided to stay. You know, that when you live and you have an education like that, I think that really impacts on people's imaginations and people's sense of what's possible. And when you see your own culture and your own culture's imagination not reflected in the culture around you and in the education that you receive, I think that has a really negative impact on the imagination. I would recommend a really amazing article that I read this morning called The Black Imagination by Joel, somebody that was on Medium, which is a really beautiful exploration of that in much more detail than I have time for now.
Great, thank you very much. And we just do what Kerry just asked. Is there any way you can do training on how to use the model?
Yeah, that's a good question. Not yet, but there is I have been developing a kind of a 2-day course based on the book more widely, not just on the model. But if you look at robhopkins.net, there is a blog about it which goes into quite a lot of detail about it, and has lots of links off to other examples and stories and activities and stuff like that. So maybe that's a good place to start for now.
Okay, thank you.